This is Jean Marie Ward for BuzzyMultimedia.com, reporting from Balticon 45 in Baltimore, Maryland. With me today is Michael Swanwick, whose genre-bending and genre-blending novels and stories have won just about every science fiction and fantasy award out there, many times over. Welcome, Michael.
Good to be here.
Thank you. Con games and humor, to say nothing of wordplay, play an important role in your fiction. What's the allure of them?
A con game is basically what a writer does is a con game. It's you get the reader's confidence. You convince them that you're his or her friend, and then you take terrible advantage of them. And hopefully you also relieve them of a little bit of money, but not much, not as much if you're selling them a book.
Okay, not as much as if you're selling them a book.
Not as much money. You're not relieving them as much as much money when you're selling them a book as you are when you're emptying their wallet.
Ah, that's the comparison there. What do you think readers find so attractive in reading about these things? I mean, you've just gone back to the world of Darger and Surplus, and they're very, very popular among your fans, and they take a lot of people for a ride in those books and stories.
I figured out that the secret behind Darger and Surplus is that they honestly believe that they are good people who are having a very pleasant time. And of course they're completely deluded in this, but they have this blind spot. And so they're traveling through the world, they're perfectly happy, they have these adventures, and they think that they're really quite splendid. They think that they're leaving behind nothing but goodwill in their wake. And you and I and everybody else, we spend a lot of time worrying about our behavior and the consequences of our actions. And we want to be sure that we're behaving well and that we're doing everything that our mothers want us to. And that doesn't bother them at all. They're perfectly oblivious. They're perfectly happy. And it's sort of nice to take a vacation from our lives into the minds of people who find the world such a pleasant place.
The people who encounter them may not find it that pleasant, but what the heck.
Well, a lot of those people don't deserve a pleasant place in the world. I'm very careful. They only steal from people who really deserve to have something bad happen to them.
And that makes everybody feel a lot better. Justice is served in fiction, if not in real life.
That's true.
Do you try to have justice happen in all of your stories?
I try to tell the truth in all of my stories, and that's why sometimes my stories are kind of dark, because sometimes the truth is dark. But you want to you don't want to mislead people about the nature of the world, and particularly you don't want to mislead young people who read books in part to help figure out the world. You don't want to lie to them at all. Of course, you are lying to them, but God's given you a license to lie in this one specific case. And the result of that is that when you're given this extraordinary privilege, you're supposed to use it well. You're supposed to use it wisely. You're supposed to say something worth hearing. And that's what I try to do.
Say something worth hearing. Well, you've been saying things worth hearing since 1970 and getting paid for it since 1980.
That's true.
I'd say that's a pretty good record. What prompted you to start mixing fantasy in your science fiction and science fiction in your fantasy?
I became a writer one night in 1966 or 67. I finished my homework. I was a junior in high school, and I picked up a copy of The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. My sister had sent it home from college because with some other books she was done with. And I thought I would read a chapter or two before I went to bed. And I stayed up all night. I read the final page just as I was going into homeroom. I skipped breakfast to do that. I read all the way to school. And Tolkien just rang me like a bell. And I desperately wanted to become a fantasy writer at that point. And I wanted to read all the fantasy I could. It turned out that in 1966 or 67 there was almost no fantasy in print, and within like 6 months I had read all of it. So I began reading science fiction because it gave a fantasy-like kick. And over the years reading science fiction, my primary loyalty shifted from fantasy to science fiction because science fiction is harder to write. You have to be able to write well, and you have to know something about science as well. So a young person responds to the harder challenge. And but all the time that I was writing science fiction, I also wanted to write fantasy. I could not find a good way to do this. I went to Ireland in 1982 with my wife Marianne, and everything here looked different from the way that I imagined it. And the castles were smaller, the ruins were older, we saw Newgrange, and it looked like it had been built by a race of conqueror hobbits. It's huge and magnificent and cute all at once. And I came away from this. I said, you know, I can't write fantasy, high fantasy at all, because I didn't grow up in high fantasy country the way the Brits did and the Irish did. I grew up reading their books. And then one day I was driving to Pittsburgh with my wife, and I made a joke. I was talking about dragons, and we were talking about steam locomotives, and I made a joke about the Baldwin Steam Dragon Works. And Marianne laughed. We drove on for about a mile, and then I said, write that down. As I realized that there was a story there. And when I went to write it, what became The Iron Dragon's Daughter, I realized I'd finally found a way for an American to write high fantasy. I could write, it's set in a world that had strip malls and high schools and other hideous places, factories and go-go bars and so on. And I could be writing from primary experience rather than doing imitation books. Mm-hmm. So that's how the important merger for me came.
It's getting back to the subject of challenges, you know, the challenge of science fiction. You're also famous for big, sprawling, unlikely series such as The Sleep of Reason, which was based on 80 prints by the Spanish artist Goya, and The Periodic Table of Science Fiction for sci-fi.com. Were you ever scared when you undertook to write these?
Well, the first one I did was The Periodic Table, and I was commissioned for that. I had done an abecedary or two before, one short story for every letter of the alphabet, and it was thought that I might do something similar, and I thought, well, I've proven I can do the abecedary, so there's really no challenge to it, and there's no difficulty to it, and I would have a very hard time doing it as a result of being a boring thing. But I thought of the idea of one for every element, and I said, that's difficult, and that I would respond to well. And it's like when you go to the circus and you watch the trapeze artists, and you don't want them to fall, but knowing that if they did fall, that it would be a very bad thing. It brings it a kind of excitement. So as I was writing these, it was very important to me to know that I could crash and burn, that there was an actual real danger, and that kept it all alive for me. I only had, as it turned out, I only had one moment when I almost did, and that was in The Periodic Table. I came to vanadium, and I went, vanadium, you know, well, it sounds like vans, but there's not much story there. It rhymes with Canadian, but that's not, or almost rhymes with Canadian. There's no story there either. And I researched it, and I researched it. The most interesting thing I could find out about it was that it was an essential element in the diet of chickens. And fortunately, when I went into the project, I had written myself one get out of jail free card, and I pulled it out now. So I said, vanadium's the couch potato of the periodic table. It never hitchhikes naked to the west coast. It never goes mountain climbing and is saved from falling off the side of Everest by a single python and the quick thinking of its friends. It never does this, it never does that, it never does the other thing. Got to the end, I said, okay, I really ducked the bullet on this one. Did I get letters? Turns out that vanadium has a lot of fans. I said, I have this letter. This guy said, it's a catalyst, for God's sakes. How boring can a catalyst be? It it was only long after the fact that I discovered I was researching some other element on I was getting in trouble on the web, and I discovered almost by accident that the periodic table of science fiction was being used as included a list of tools that chemistry teachers could use to turn kids on to chemistry. So I had just stabbed every chemistry teacher in the world in the back.
Oh no! Oh no!
You know, and who deserves less to be betrayed than a chemistry teacher? They provide this wonderful element of madness to our world.
Wonderful element of madness. They're the necessary step to getting people to do all the chemical wonders that make our life possible. And dang, and you know, here you try so hard in your fiction, A, to tell the truth, and B, to provide value. Look what you did, completely by accident.
That was very bad of me. Yes.